Hey, Rylan here at the Vic Shop. Today I wanted to talk a little about Victory's gear drive primary and driveline slack. It's something that a lot of people comment on, especially their first time on a Victory. They're not. It's a lot different than another bike, and specifically like a Harley that's got a chain-driven drive. These have a gear drive from the crankshaft to the balance shaft and then to the transmission, and then in between is this torque compensator, which has kind of got a big spring on it. And what I hear from a lot of folks, maybe when they buy their first Victory, is it's got a lot of driveline slack. And like I'm coming up to a stop sign, there's this big clunk that I feel and hear, and then I can kind of roll on and off the throttle and hear this clunk, 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 clunk. And usually my answer is, well, you're just riding it wrong. You're riding it at too low of an RPM. And so to kind of explain what all that is, I guess I'm going to start with the rear wheel and go forward. So I got this transmission shaft here, and there's a couple of transmission shafts like this inside your case, and the dogs and the pockets, I don't know if you can see this, how close we're getting here. These are engagement dogs, where the two gears will engage and give you power, and there's a slot here. And so these dogs and slots are not the same size. There's some play between them, and so when it's in gear, it naturally has this play. And so when you're rolling along, the power from the engine is sending torque through the driveline, through the primary drive, through the transmission, out the belt to your rear wheel. And so there's always this momentum and force that's keeping your transmission to one side. The engagement dogs are pushing against each other. We're moving forward. But then when you kind of coast to a stop, and the momentum of the bike and all the force of the rear wheel and the weight of the bike, if the RPMs get so low, then the force from the rear wheel and everything will force the dogs and pockets. They're tight when there's power on, but when there's power off, they get a little slack here, and sometimes they can snap back and make that noise as it's hitting the other side of the pocket. And so then that is transferred back through, and the clutch is here, and then it's kind of forcing the torque compensator as well, which gets me into the torque compensator. So now we got force that's kind of pushing the bike, lunging it forward, and that's one of the purposes of the torque compensator, which we have here in the middle between the clutch and the power from the engine. So let me get a little closer on this torque compensator. And take a look at that and see. Yeah, so let me put it together for you. The torque compensator, it's got this stack of well, they call them Bellevue washers, but it's really a spring. It's like a spring that you can take apart. These are concave pieces of metal that you stack on top of each other and mix a stack, and that's really the spring here that holds back this ramp, which we can see here. And so you can see these three kind of cam ramps and their corresponding pocket here. This is kind of a pain to get back on. Shouldn't have taken it off for the video. So when the engine's got power and it's moving the torque this way, actually at idle, let's start at idle, the torque compensator would probably look like this if you could see it running with like, a plexiglass cover on here, and the engine's firing and it's creating pulses, and this thing is probably just sitting here kind of doing one of these at idle, and you can sometimes hear that. And in progressively later models of Victory, like the early Victories, they had a very basic cover, no webbing or anything inside, and you could really hear this torque compensator kind of rattling back and forth against its spring, and then you put it in gear and go, and it goes away. And then they must have had some customer complaints, because in later model years they really added a lot of padding to the primary cover, and they modified the torque compensator so it was quieter at idle. But what that got is more driveline slack, especially kind of coming down to a stop or whatever. So anyway, so at idle, it's just kind of sitting here rattling. But then as soon as you put it in gear and you start moving and the engine's applying torque, then it kind of stays quiet, and it's just kind of locked in its place, and it's transferring power, and it takes little vibrations from here and there, and evens them out and gives you a nice smooth ride that's not quite so harsh, being how it's geared all together and there's no slack. So this is kind of like the slack. But then when you get in that situation, like let's say you're cruising around 25 miles an hour in second gear, and you kind of roll up to a stop sign without pulling in the clutch, and you hear that clunk, and that again is all that force coming back, clunking through your transmission gears, and then forcing this the opposite direction, and you can also hear that. So that's kind of that clunk. And so you may have heard tossed around that people have been modifying the torque compensator, and so I want to talk a little about that. I don't do it a lot, usually just on problem bikes or really high mileage bikes where the spring is getting loose. So if you take this apart, you can see there's this stack of springs here. This one's been modified. Let me show you what it looked like when it came out of the bike. And of course you've got a tech manual, so you can see all this. They've got a couple of light springs here, and then a couple of heavy springs, and they're all stacked on top of each other. A couple heavy, so I guess I'll take it apart here. These are, they're dished, and so you put the dishes together so the convex sides are facing each other. It actually has a mark on it that says up. And this is kind of a spring. It's like a stack of these convex washers. And actually this one here on late 2012 and early 13 and beyond, this is what the stack will look like. There's a couple of light washers here, a flat spacer, and then a couple of heavies. On earlier builds, this whole thing was different design, and it had two of these thick sets. And so what I'll do is, well, actually, I got a collection of used parts, and I've just got some spare springs laying around. These are like $13 new from Victory, or I'm sure they're a dime a dozen on eBay. So what I do is I take out this flat spacer. Again, this is a later model one. And so now I've got these two that are facing each other. And so I flip it so they're now the same rather than opposite. They are flipped the same direction, and this kind of makes one of these. And then I've got another thick one. So basically this is a $13 modification, because what I've done is reused all this and added this $13 thing. And so now the two concave sides are, this is making a spring basically just like these are. It's just a third coil, I guess you could say. So this is what I do. So I don't want to go crazy. I don't want to stack the spring way up. It's got to fit in here, and there's, well, let's see, where's the cap? This has to reach a certain depth to lock in, and then it's got a lock nut and everything. So you can't like stack 7 of these on top of each other. It's got to be close. I've measured it out, and this stack is about 0.8 millimeters thicker than the previous version, and 0.8 is enough that we can squeeze it in there. And so I've done this to several bikes, new and old. Oh, okay, sorry. So if you had an old style, like 2012 and older, had a couple of these, and what I've done is again bought another $13 thick washer, and I just added one to the backside, and that seems to work on the older ones as well. And if you want, I mean, you can take heavies and smalls. And oh, I'm sorry, I think what I did on that one, last one I may have used 2 of these lighter ones from a 13 and later and stacked them on there. But I don't have an example here. But basically, I'll measure it out with the caliper and make sure that I'm getting stiffer springs in there, but not trying to increase the height drastically. So yeah, that's kind of a little about the torque compensator and that driveline slack you're feeling. Oh, one more thing. So when you tighten this up, you're going to hear it more at idle. It's got a tighter um, spring set, so now you're going to hear it clunking. It doesn't have as a light of a spring anymore that's going to take up these vibrations, and you're going to hear this thing rattling around, and that's the price you pay for tightening up that drive line. But you'll notice it's smoother when you're out riding it and you're coming up to a stop sign or whatever. There's less of that clunk, and so it's a trade-off there. So yeah, I think that about covers it. Good luck. Call me if you need anything.